Estilo Swing tenemos a un invitado, la fama del cual precede a su nombre. Es gran bailarín de espléndida técnica y también de originalidad y creatividad muy altas. Es Jamin, el profesor de los bailes swing de los Estados Unidos. Hemos preparado unas cuantas preguntas para Jamin que creo que sean de gran interés para todos los que están relacionados con el mundo swing. Entonces empezamos con las preguntas. Okay, so if we start from the very beginning, I think from the very childhood, at only 11, we know from one of your articles you want to be a dancer. You exactly knew what you wanted to be. So naturally that you've been tried so different types of dancing so far. That's why the question. Yeah, how do you see not fusion as such, but distant elements that can borrow Lindy Hop? Would it rather be for you a new born style, or maybe a distortion of Lindy, distorted version of Lindy?
Well, that's such a really good question. For me, I have a very interesting background in dance, obviously like you had mentioned. And when I came into Lindy Hop as an American, I first have to recognize it is my people's dance, Black people's dance.
Yeah.
And there's a huge responsibility in looking at the dance through the lens of being a steward, taking care of it for the next generation. And it's quite difficult for people like me in America. My background is hip-hop dancing, and a lot of times we're always coming up with new things. We're considered to be the people of the now, but a lot of times we need to have improvements when it comes to craftsmanship and maintaining history and the important things that have come before. So, in its essence, when Lindy Hop first started, it was much like the hip hop of that time, where the common language was dancing together, but most of the ideas were about improvisation and creativity. And so as a 21st century American, I first have to recognize, okay, I've got a responsibility to preserve Lindy Hop for future generations, at least some of the more fundamental concepts of what Lindy Hop is. And then I need to also add my unique voice to Lindy Hop in order to maintain that spirit of creativity. So I do think there is a necessary balance where one has to pull from the past, build on top of the past, but I also think to be critically tied to the spirit of Lindy Hop, we must be innovators.
Can we express something of our personality in dance, or it's maybe, I know, it's an image,
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. The way I actually look at dance is very similar to human emotion.
Yeah.
For me, it's no different than music or beautiful art. Except when we dance, it is a interpretation of what a human feels on the inside, but we use our bodies as the instrument to demonstrate that. So it's very hard for someone to hide their personality and their preferences when they start dancing, because in a way it really is a piece of who they are as a human being. I think it was Mikhail Brishnikov that may have said he can watch a person move and he can know more about that person than they would ever know. And I think there's some truth to that. I think you're right about that people really can't hide their personality when they dance. It is part of who they are. And I think that's what makes dancing so special, when we have people open themselves up and take the risk and looking silly or foolish, but genuinely letting us come into their world a little bit without us leaving our own.
It reminds me of one passage with Václav Nijinsky. It was a ballet dancer from Poland, Russian Poland. So when he couldn't say something to her girlfriend, to her woman in another language, he just danced it for her.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but something, yeah.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah.
That brings to my memory a time where I actually taught a group of deaf students the shim sham.
Yeah.
And they couldn't hear the music at all, but because they were so excited and their attention was laser focused, they learned it in like 15 minutes. I mean, come on, that's unbelievable.
We know what effort one needs to make to achieve very high level in dancing. So what would be your advice to inspire dancers at what musicality, decoration elements before well-settled fundamentals, well-settled bases, well-assimilated stable technique of leading following? What would be your message?
Well, I go back to that idea of opposites attracting, balance. Lindy Hop is really, for me, an expression of polar opposites coming together. You have the rhythm section, and then you have the soloists. You have black people, and you have white people, and you have poor, you have rich, you have male, you have female. And I think that dichotomy of separation coming together is what makes Lindy Hop so powerful. And so what I would say to a person who is more on the creative side of expressing themselves, to first approach Lindy Hop with humility. You want to come into it recognizing it's an art form that came from the past, and you want to be a part of that legacy by honoring those who came before you and learning everything that they had to contribute to the art form, so that you don't end up recreating the wheel per se. I remember when I was a young dancer, I was very influenced by Michael Jackson and Fred Astaire and many of the great dancers of the past. And I studied them. I learned from them as best I could, but I never tried to just beat them or ignore them or just do my own thing. I really looked at myself as a part of American dance history, and I learned as much as I could with humility, so that when I did master it and I did understand how it worked, I could feel very comfortable sharing that same legacy with new dancers, but also add my personality. Very beginning, I was a hip-hop dancer coming into Lindy Hop, and so I knew I had no problem feeling comfortable creating all the time. I needed to understand on a fundamental level how Lindy Hop actually works. So most of the dancers I spent time with were more of the craftsmen, the more technical dancers. A lot of people may look at them and say, oh, they're a little boring because they don't do anything super creative. And I could have easily had that judgment on them, but I really needed them at the time to help me understand how Lindy Hop actually worked, to not inhibit me from being creative, but to actually liberate me to understand my unique part in Lindy Hop as I mastered the fundamentals.
It's again about balance, I think, but sometimes maybe they would like to avoid the hard, maybe boring work and go to the most interesting, the self-expression. But self-expression is very difficult when you don't know basics and when you just don't need to feel like a bull in a china shop when it's in social dancing.
Yeah, that's true. I do think it's a big struggle for people in the 21st century to yield to something that came before them. It takes a tremendous amount of honesty and humility and respect for the art form. One cannot say they love Lindy Hop and come into Lindy Hop and immediately want to change it and immediately want to do what one wants in spite of what came before. So that's my philosophy, is we should always be adding value to the Lindy Hop, adding more on top of it, but we should never take anything away from it. Everything should be building on top.
Did you do when you achieved this point, maybe the point of so-called stagnation?
Yeah, it's an interesting position to be in, especially if you're someone who is creative and you find yourself hitting a plateau and you get kind of frustrated and you just want to stop dancing. What I would do is I would listen to the music more. I started to take my eyes away from just moving and coming up with ideas, but to really put myself in a vulnerable position to identify with the musicians, the people who are making this beautiful emotion come out of music, and allow myself to tap into that. And so one of the things that I did is I put boundaries around my dancing by making myself become vulnerable in certain situations. So let's say, for example, if I was dancing with a partner, I would practice only using one hand for the entire dance. Or I would practice never going to the left when I always go to the left. And so when I would do this, because I had to help myself realize that creativity doesn't just come from the mind. The mind is a computer. It processes information, but ideas come from someplace else that we don't really fully understand as humans. But we can tap into those ideas when we make ourselves vulnerable and we allow the emotion to penetrate our heart, and then we immediately take action. And so for me, I would put myself in those situations to try to capture creativity as it happened, without me knowing exactly what I was going to do next. Now, the only way it really worked is if I could see myself doing that. So I had to take a video camera, set it up, and looked really foolish. It felt stupid. I didn't feel like I looked good, but I had to look at myself from a third-party perspective, being vulnerable and taking risks, calculated risks now, not dramatically dangerous risks, but I made myself do that so that I could see things that I may not have been able to see if I was overthinking with my brain.
So I think it's a kind of challenge too. When you mentioned that you can dance only with one hand, or maybe don't go into the right or to the left, so it's a kind of challenge too for you.
Yeah.
You need transgression. You need to come through and I think leave these boundaries.
Absolutely. And I tell you what, it's a real fun process because I still do it. I still do this process just to keep myself connected to the spirit of swing dancing, which was really the heart of improvisation and one making themselves vulnerable to music and capturing that idea in the moment in time. Today, we still do that, but the genre of music is different. In America, we would call it rhythm and poetry, but really it's called rap. They would take words and improvise words with amazing meaning to it, but they're not. A lot of times people would call it freestyling. In swing, we don't use that word, but that's literally what I'm doing in swing. It's just seeing what I can do in the moment. And it's scary, but it's incredibly invigorating.